They didn't believe in easing your pain. They believed your pain was part of the cure. You wake up bound to a table soaked in someone else's blood. Your mouth is stuffed with wool to muffle the screams. A man in a robe steps forward. His sleeves are darkened by years of soaked-in bodily fluids. In his hands a bronze hook and a bone saw blackened by time rust and repetition. He smiles. His teeth are rotted. You're not in a hospital. You're in a medieval surgical chamber, a place where your suffering is the centerpiece of the treatment. Where agony is expected. Where surviving the operation is less common than not. The pain hasn't started yet, but it will. And when it does, you'll beg for death. Medieval surgery wasn't medicine. It was war waged against the body in blind desperation. Centuries before anesthesia, before germ theory, before even the basic idea of sanitation, surgeons worked in a world where the human body was seen as a vessel of sin, imbalance, and divine punishment. Healing meant punishment. Cutting meant hope. And most disturbingly of all, it was often your best chance. They believed the body was ruled by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, madness, seizures, infections, all blamed on a misalignment of these invisible forces. And how did they fix this imbalance? They drained you. Bloodletting became one of the most trusted and deadly tools in a surgeon's arsenal. If you had a fever, they bled you. A headache. Bleed. A cough, a dream that frightened you. An upset stomach after eating spoiled meat. Open a vein and let the sickness flow. This wasn't a few drops carefully drawn with a needle. This was arterial blood taken by slicing a vein with a lancet, often in large quantities. They measured your health in pints spilled. In more gruesome cases, they used heated cups to draw blood directly from lacerated skin, a method that left round blistered scars and drained the patient into a coma. The success rate depressingly low. But when the alternatives were prayer amulets or exorcism, the bleeding blade seemed downright scientific. And who wielded these blades? Not trained doctors. Medicine as a scholarly discipline was reserved for the privileged, cloistered in universities where they argued about Aristotle instead of opening bodies. Actual surgeries left to barbers, literally. The same men who trimmed your beard were trusted to cut out your infected gallbladder. Their toolkits were identical razors, knives, and shears, only one set stained with hair, the other with blood. But let's talk about amputations. Nothing reveals the raw horror of medieval surgery like the act of sawing through a human limb without pain relief. Soldiers wounded in battle by arrow mace or worse were dragged into makeshift surgical tents. Infection set in quickly. If the limb began to blacken or swell, it meant gangrene had arrived. The only cure? Cut it off. Fast. The process was merciless. A rope was tied above the joint as a crude tourniquet. The surgeon would slice through the skin and muscle in swift circles, exposing the bone. Then the saw, often dull, reused, and unclean, sank into the marrow. You could hear it, the scraping, screeching rhythm of death, dressed as mercy. The moment the limb detached, the stump was cauterized with hot iron sealing blood vessels, burning nerve endings, and ensuring infection had one less path inside. The pain was so extreme that many passed out. Some bit through their own tongues, others never woke up at all. But the most terrifying detail: sometimes these procedures were done not out of desperation, but out of policy. In plague-stricken towns, if a wound looked suspicious, it was better to amputate than risk contagion. A farmer with a swollen foot might lose his leg before his breakfast. Better to sacrifice the part than the whole, they thought. Better still to do it quickly. Before the priest finished his prayers, surgical instruments of the period were as grotesque as their uses. Iron clamps to pull flesh back, trephines to drill through skulls, hooks, spikes, cauteries. They weren't sanitized between patients. Blood dried on the handles. Bone dust clung to the edges. A tool used to bore into the brain of a man with a head wound might be used on a child with a toothache next. Cross-contamination was not just common, it was inevitable and fatal. Yet this was not the work of madmen. These were the trusted hands of healing. Townspeople would pay handsomely for a surgeon to operate despite knowing they might not return home. They lined up outside cathedrals with wounds wrapped in cloth, praying for their chance at the blade. because the only thing worse than medieval surgery was not getting it. Some of the earliest surgical textbooks, like those written by Guy de Chauliac in the 14th century, described in astonishing detail how to cut, cauterize, and stitch. Trepanation, or the act of drilling a hole in the skull, was recommended for head trauma and madness. The theory, releasing pressure, bad spirits, or simply giving the soul a way out. The results: sometimes miraculous, often monstrous. One wrong angle and you weren't cured. You were lobotomized. They also treated cataracts by jabbing sharp needles into the eye and dislodging the lens into the bottom of the socket, restoring some vision at the cost of unbearable pain and a lifetime of blurred shapes. Toothaches solved with pliers. The tooth was crushed, yanked, or broken apart. Patients were held down. Screams were considered a normal part of the process. And then there was lithotomy, perhaps the most feared operation of them all. It was the removal of bladder stones without anesthetic, performed by inserting a metal rod into the urethra and using forceps to pull the stone out. A man would be held down by 3 assistants while the surgeon operated from between his legs. The agony was indescribable. Many died. Those who lived were often left incontinent or mutilated. Still, the suffering wasn't the failure. It was expected. Pain meant the treatment was working. The screams, proof of life. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world is this, where a cure looks worse than the disease? Where relief means fire and steel? Where silence isn't peace but death? And more chillingly, if this was done in the name of healing, what horrors were committed in the name of punishment? The human body was a mystery, so naturally they treated it like a sin. In the medieval world, illness wasn't just a physical affliction, it was a spiritual consequence. Disease was divine punishment, a judgment passed down from God himself. And if your body failed you, it meant your soul had already started to rot. That twisted theology didn't just shape how people saw sickness, it dictated how they treated it. Surgery, for all its horror, was a last resort. First you had to confess, then you had to pray. And only then, if the angels were silent and your flesh had begun to blacken, could the blade come out. Hospitals as we imagine them today didn't exist. The earliest ones were more like hostels for the dying, places to suffer in cleanliness, surrounded by crucifixes and whispered prayers. Healing wasn't the goal. Redemption was. And the caregivers, monks, nuns, religious orders who believed more in holy water than antiseptics, more in relics than remedies. The body was a temporary vessel. If it failed, so be it. The soul was eternal. Miracles were often more trusted than medicine. People would travel hundreds of miles to kneel before a saint's tomb, to press a festering wound against a sacred relic, or drink water from a well said to have healing powers. There are accounts of epileptics being chained to altars overnight, their seizures interpreted as proof of demonic possession. The next morning, bruised and exhausted, they were declared cured, not because the seizures stopped, but because they had survived the night. Those who didn't, martyrs. Holy deaths. The church had a complicated relationship with surgery. On one hand, it condemned the mutilation of the body. Clerics were forbidden from shedding blood. Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. The church abhors blood. On the other hand, they funded hospitals and encouraged the use of saints and healing rituals. The result was a perverse hierarchy. The spiritually clean priests and scholars were not allowed to cut, while the unclean barbers and butchers were given the knives. Knowledge stayed cloistered. Experience stayed bloody. This spiritual gatekeeping led to some truly bizarre treatments. Boils and tumors were smeared with the fat of roasted cats. Toothaches were cured by kissing a donkey's mouth. Leprosy bathed in the blood of a virgin if you could find one. Or better yet, burn the leper's clothes and pray you hadn't breathed too deeply. Surgeons, meanwhile, were often distrusted. They were seen as necessary evils tolerated only because their craft worked when all else failed. Guy de Chauliac, one of the most respected surgeons of the 14th century, even wrote about his reluctance to perform certain operations, fearing not just the patient's death, but his own damnation. He wasn't alone. Many surgeons refused to cut unless they had received spiritual permission. Others left the room entirely if a priest entered. Surgery and salvation rarely shared space. But when plague came, none of that mattered. The Black Death, arriving in Europe in 1347, swept across the continent like an apocalyptic tide. By the time it subsided, it had killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, nearly half the population. The church was powerless. The saints stayed silent. The relics didn't glow, and in that silence people turned to the only ones still willing to act: the surgeons. And the surgeons panicked. They blamed the stars. They blamed bad air. They blamed the Jews, the prostitutes, the poor. Cities rounded up scapegoats, burned them in pyres, and still the bodies piled up in the streets. Surgery for plague was frantic, grotesque, and usually fatal. Buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that burst with pus and blood, were sliced open with unclean knives. The stench was indescribable, the pain unbearable. Hot pokers were shoved into the wounds to burn out the poison. People died screaming as rats scattered beneath their beds. But some procedures bordered on sadistic. Surgeons began experimenting with full-body lancing, believing that by slicing the skin all over they could release the sickness. Others advocated for plague masks not to protect the wearer, but to pump in pungent herbs believed to counteract miasma. These beaked masks became the symbol of plague doctors, eerie shadows moving through alleyways and death carts. But inside those robes, often barbers, sometimes charlatans, rarely healers. Still in the chaos, something shifted. The plague shattered the monopoly of the church on health. It exposed the limits of faith and the need for practical, brutal solutions. And with the death toll climbing, people began to value the blade over the prayer. It was the surgeons, crude and bloody as they were, who started to rise in prominence. One particularly infamous example was Theodoric Borgognoni, a 13th century surgeon who dared to contradict Galen the ancient Roman, whose theories dominated medicine for over 1,000 years. Theodoric washed his hands. He even cleaned wounds with wine. He wrote that pus was not a good sign. For this he was ridiculed by his peers, and yet his patients survived in higher numbers than anyone else's. But his ideas came too soon. Most of his contemporaries believed that if a wound didn't suppurate ooze thick yellow pus, then it wasn't healing. They'd pack injuries with dirt or dung to encourage infection, not realizing they were dooming the patient. Cleanliness was heresy. Pain was doctrine. Even childbirth, one of the most natural experiences, became a surgical battlefield. Midwives, mostly women, were forbidden from formal training. Surgeons, almost all men, took over complicated births and turned them into nightmares. If a child was stuck, they used iron hooks to drag it out dead or alive. The mother often bled to death on the floor, clutching a cross as the surgeon prayed and pulled. And behind all of it was the quiet, creeping idea: suffering purifies. Pain is sacred. If your body breaks under the knife, maybe it was supposed to. Maybe it was God's will. So what happens when society treats agony as a virtue, when pain is the prescription and survival is a fluke? What happens when people start to like the cutting? They called them surgeons, but make no mistake, these men were trained in blood, not mercy. In the dim alleys behind taverns and candlelit backrooms, reeking of rot and bile, young boys were handed their first knives not to shave beards or slice meat, but to hold limbs steady as they were hacked off. This was how you learned the trade, not in lecture halls, but beside a man moaning on a plank, while hot irons hissed in nearby braziers. Your teacher, a master barber surgeon, whose fingernails were black with old blood. Your curriculum. Flesh, bone, scream, repeat. Surgical training in the Middle Ages wasn't regulated by universities, it was regulated by guilds. And those guilds had far more in common with butchers and blacksmiths than any modern concept of medical professionalism. The company of barber surgeons, for instance, flourished in cities like London and Paris. Its members performed everything from haircuts to hernia removals. If you needed a tooth pulled or a tumor lanced, they were your only option. But to become one of them, you had to watch, then imitate, then bleed. Apprenticeships often began in adolescence and could last up to 7 years. You started with the easiest tasks: sharpening blades, boiling cloth, cleaning wounds, holding torches. But soon you'd be expected to assist in amputations, pour boiling oil into gashes, and eventually cut. There was no anesthesia, so speed mattered more than skill. The best surgeons weren't gentle. They were fast. A clean leg amputation in under 90 seconds. That earned respect. Hesitation earned death. There was no room for weakness. If you fainted, you were ridiculed. If you hesitated, you endangered the patient. If you refused to act, you failed the guild. In time, the trauma of watching and causing unimaginable suffering hardened these young men. Many developed what we'd now call emotional detachment, or worse, a grim fascination. They didn't just learn to cut. They wanted to. Some even grew to enjoy it. Surgeons of the late medieval period were obsessed with spectacle. Public dissections, when allowed, drew crowds like theater. Corpses, usually of executed criminals, were flayed open in great halls, their organs lifted for all to see. Students scribbled frantically. Viewers gasped, gagged, prayed. The human body was laid bare not as an object of respect, but as a gruesome puzzle to be solved, or a dark curiosity to be gawked at. And there in the flickering torchlight, future surgeons learned how to navigate the labyrinth of muscle and sinew. But live patients were the true test. And unlike corpses, they could scream. A common mid-level procedure was the treatment of anal fistulas, painful infected tunnels between the rectum and the skin. The solution: insert a metal rod to find the tunnel's end, then cut it open inch by inch all the way through. The patient was fully conscious. This wasn't an emergency procedure, it was routine. Royalty even had it done. King Louis XIV of France famously underwent this barbaric operation in 1686, centuries after the supposed end of medieval medicine. He was cut open near the anus and left to recover, unable to sit properly for months. He lived, barely, but his successful survival launched the procedure into popularity, and soon it was in vogue among nobles. Pain became proof of status. Surgeons also developed an infamous obsession with hernias, not curing them, removing them. The operation required slicing through the abdomen, pushing the intestine back into place, and often sewing the wound closed with thread made from animal gut. Sterile techniques didn't exist. Post-operative infections were nearly guaranteed. Yet people submitted willingly because the alternative disfigurement, social shame, or death was worse. One horrifying tool used during this time was the cervical dilator employed during complicated births or uterine issues. It was essentially a metal device inserted into the cervix, then cranked open to widen the canal. No anesthesia, no mercy. The pain was beyond description. In many cases, the procedure caused irreparable tearing infection or death. But for surgeons, it was an innovation, an experiment, a triumph of steel over suffering. And through all of this, the screaming, the rotting, the bloodletting surgeons began to see themselves as something more. Not just tradesmen, not just cutters, but scientists, professionals, innovators, men of knowledge. So they wrote books, manuals, illustrated guides to incisions and instruments, and those guides, they read like battle plans, step-by-step instructions on how to remove an eye, or pull a bladder stone, or separate conjoined twins. The diagrams were beautiful in a way only the grotesque can be: meticulous ink drawings of flayed faces, exploded abdomens, slit open skulls. Yet for every skilled practitioner, there were a dozen frauds, charlatans, traveling surgeons who set up tents outside village gates promising to cure blindness, remove tumors, or fix impotence with secret elixirs and magical knives. These men often did more harm than good, carving up desperate peasants and vanishing before the infection set in. But they thrived because people were desperate. When death is certain, even the cruelest hand can look like salvation. The guilds tried to police these rogues, but their own standards were inconsistent. Some barber surgeons had decades of experience. Others barely knew how to tie a bandage. And still they wielded the same tools: hooks, forceps, clamps, scalpels, saws. The same kits passed from hand to hand, worn smooth by years of use and slicked dark by the fluids of the dying. Eventually, efforts were made to bring structure to this madness. In 1540, Henry VIII of England merged the barbers and surgeons companies, creating a unified guild. It was a step toward professionalism, but still a far cry from safety. The act allowed barbers to continue cutting hair and performing surgeries. The only difference now, they had a royal license. By this point, the image of the barber pole had already become iconic: white for bandages, red for blood, blue for veins. It was a symbol not of beauty, but of butchery. A silent banner for anyone seeking relief through agony. A promise that inside someone would cut you open and maybe save your life. The line between healing and hurting had never been thinner. And behind closed doors, a darker question began to emerge. What happens when the blade becomes the master and the body just a canvas? The human skull was sacred. It held the soul, the seat of reason, the breath of God. And yet surgeons couldn't stop drilling into it. Trepanation, the act of boring a hole into a living person's skull. Perhaps the oldest known surgical procedure, dating back thousands of years, but practiced with terrifying regularity in the medieval period. Sometimes it was to relieve pressure after a head injury. Sometimes it was to release evil spirits. Sometimes it was just because the patient wouldn't stop screaming, and the only solution left was to open their head and see what poured out. The tools were rudimentary: a circular saw known as a trephine, a chisel, a hammer. No antiseptic, no anesthesia, no imaging to guide them. Just the surgeon's instincts and the sound of cracking bone. The patient, awake but restrained, could feel every vibration, every crunch, as the blade slowly carved through the layers of their skull. Sometimes the bone was scraped away bit by bit. Other times it was punched through with brutal force. And if the tool went too deep, the brain was punctured. Game over. But that wasn't considered failure. That was just the risk. Trepanation wasn't fringe. It was taught in surgical manuals, discussed by prominent physicians, even recommended in cases of melancholia, epilepsy, and possession. There are accounts, detailed clinical accounts, of opening up the skull to release trapped humors or vent madness. The logic: if the mind is sick, the head must be opened like a wine barrel gone sour. In the 13th century, the famed Arab physician al-Zahrawi included trepanation diagrams in his Kitab al-Tasrif, a medical encyclopedia that would be read across Europe for generations. The illustrations showed skulls with neat circular holes, carefully labeled instruments, and instructions on how to protect the brain membrane once exposed. The precision is astonishing, the reality less so. For every patient who survived the opening of their skull, countless others died of infection, hemorrhage, or seizures induced by the procedure itself. And yet, people lined up to have it done. Because when the head ached like it was splitting apart, when the voices wouldn't stop, when the darkness wouldn't lift, this was the only cure they were offered. But not all cutting of the skull was surgical. Sometimes it was punishment. Torture disguised as medicine. Madness was not well understood, nor was it treated with compassion. The insane were shackled, beaten, starved, or exorcised. In monasteries, they were whipped to drive out demons. In towns, they were paraded in chains. And when spiritual solutions failed, physical ones followed. Holes drilled in heads, hot irons pressed to the scalp, herbal concoctions forced down the throat until the patient vomited or passed out. Trepanation in some cases was both diagnosis and sentence. One documented case from 14th century Germany describes a man who believed his head was filled with boiling water. He screamed day and night. Local surgeons diagnosed vaporous imbalance and trepanned him without success. He died the next day, blood streaming from his nose and ears. The procedure was declared a failure, but not a mistake. Perhaps most chilling of all were the illustrations that accompanied these operations. Woodcuts showing surgeons holding open skulls with hooks, forceps lifting brains from their beds as assistants calmly take notes. The look on the patients' faces, if they were shown at all, was often placid, serene. A fiction, a mask for agony, because medieval surgery didn't just cut into the flesh, it cut into identity, into fear, into dignity. Trepanation was only the beginning. The brain, once breached, became a target for experimentation. In later periods, and especially during the Renaissance, surgeons began probing deeper into the cerebral structure. They mapped ventricles sliced through gray matter and extracted brain tissue in the hopes of curing seizures or mania. Sometimes they succeeded, but often they simply destroyed what made a person them. A crude form of lobotomy long before the word existed. Skull fractures were another battlefield of the surgeon's craft. A head injury from a fall, a horse kick, or a mace blow in war could shatter bone and threaten death by swelling or internal bleeding. Treatment: open the skull, remove bone fragments. Sometimes insert metal plates. Yes, metal. Archaeological finds have uncovered medieval skeletons with crude bronze or iron patches hammered into their skulls. Evidence that someone tried to rebuild the broken dome of the mind. Evidence that someone survived. But for every survivor, how many were left ruined? Blind? Paralyzed? Insensible? These weren't accidents, they were calculated risks. And no matter the outcome, the surgeon walked away a little more experienced, a little more emboldened, a little more curious. Curiosity in this age was a dangerous thing. In Paris and Bologna, the first formal anatomy theaters began to emerge, spaces where surgeons and students could observe dissections in tiered seating like spectators at a play. Bodies were stolen from graveyards, from gallows, from plague pits. Stripped, flayed, exposed, every muscle studied, every nerve traced. But these were rare, often illegal and heavily guarded. The church still considered the human body sacred in death. To cut it was desecration. But the thirst for knowledge and the thrill of cutting was growing stronger than doctrine. By the 15th century, public dissections became grand events performed for royalty and scholars alike. The smell was unbearable. The corpses, often days old, were slick with decay. But that didn't matter. The body was a book waiting to be read, and the skull was the preface. All of this fed into a new kind of medicine. One no longer content with leeches and prayers, one that demanded blood precision and control. Surgery began to shift from desperation to discipline, from ritual to science. But that shift came at a cost, because once you believe you can open the human mind, the next question is, what else can you remove? The body most often cut was female, and it was rarely by choice. In the medieval mind, a woman's body was a vessel, a source of sin, of mystery, of danger. Her blood was impure, her desires unnatural, her womb an unpredictable, shadowy cavern. The male body was the ideal, the default, but the female, that was a riddle meant to be solved with force, hooks, and holy fear. And when that body malfunctioned, when it bled too much or not at all, when it gave birth to monsters, or failed to conceive, it was the surgeon's job to correct it. With cold iron. Let's begin where most horror did: childbirth. For medieval women, giving birth was like walking a tightrope over an open grave. No pain relief, no sterile instruments, no real understanding of what caused complications, only a firm belief that pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's original sin. The midwives, usually older, experienced women from the community, handled the majority of births. But when something went wrong, the midwife stepped back, and the surgeon stepped in. And that's when things got ugly. The most feared intervention was called the craniotomy, a procedure in which a dead or stuck fetus was removed from the womb by crushing its skull. Using a long metal instrument with a sharp point and serrated edges called a cranioclast, the surgeon would insert it into the birth canal, pierce the infant's head, and break it apart to remove it piece by piece. The mother, still conscious, often torn and bleeding, was expected to endure. There was no guarantee of her survival, but to the surgeon she was secondary. The fetus, dead or malformed, was a threat to her soul, a sign of divine punishment, or worse, demonic influence. One 15th century surgical text describes the procedure in chilling detail, advising practitioners to insert the hook with care but with strength and rotate it until the cranium yields. The tone is methodical, detached, like the instructions for cleaning a blade or curing meat. Then came the cesarean section, a brutal operation, almost never performed unless the mother was already dying. It involved slicing open the abdomen with a long knife, reaching in and yanking out the child. Survival for the mother was nearly non-existent. There were no sutures, no antibiotics, no understanding of how to close a womb without triggering fatal infection. The flesh would be sewn crudely, if at all. Most women bled to death within hours. But sometimes the baby lived, and in those rare cases the surgeon was praised. The mother's sacrifice became incidental. These operations were not rare flukes. They were recorded, taught, repeated. In some towns, special birthing chairs were constructed wooden frames that kept the mother seated while giving the surgeon access to her pelvis. They were often stained with blood padded with straw and placed beside altars so that prayers could be said between contractions and incisions. Worse still was how easily a woman's womb could become grounds for suspicion. Infertility, miscarriages, stillbirths, common painful tragedies today were treated with suspicion, even accusation. A woman who failed to produce children might be branded as cursed barren or in league with the devil. She might be examined by male surgeons looking for signs of womb corruption, which could mean anything from scar tissue to imagined wandering wombs. A long-standing myth that the uterus could literally move around the body, causing madness and hysteria. Treatments. Horrifying. Vaginal fumigation, where smoke from burning herbs was funneled into the vagina through a horn-shaped tube. Forced purging with poisonous compounds, or worst of all, manual repositioning of the uterus with the surgeon's fingers or metal tools. Women were held down, their legs bound, their screams ignored or explained away as female weakness. Then there were the witch hunts. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of women were accused of witchcraft, many of them midwives or herbalists. These were the women who had knowledge of birth fertility and healing knowledge that threatened the growing dominance of male physicians in the church. Suddenly, a woman who had delivered a breech baby or treated a menstrual problem with herbs was a danger. A heretic, a womb meddler. Surgeons began inserting themselves not just into childbirth but into reproductive control. Abortions, once common and quietly performed with herbal tinctures, became dangerous crimes. Women suspected of terminating a pregnancy were subjected to forced examinations, beatings, even surgical exploration. Their bodies became crime scenes. And the surgeons, the interrogators. One of the most notorious devices used in this period was the vaginal speculum, a cruel metal instrument designed to pry open the vaginal canal. While its basic form survives in modern gynecology, the early versions were crude, rusted, and used without warning or consent. They were not tools of care but of control. Women were violated in the name of diagnosis. In some cases, the speculum was heated to sterilize it, causing burns to already traumatized tissue. Menstrual issues were also medicalized into madness. A woman who bled irregularly might be diagnosed with hysteria, a vague umbrella for anything that defied male understanding. Treatment ranged from herbal tonics to surgical cauterization of the vagina. Yes, burning. Fire as a cure for the wild womb. And always the pain was ignored. Explained away. Spiritualized. Because women, it was said, were made for suffering. It was in their nature. Their biology, their burden. There were women who resisted, who documented what they saw. One of the few was Trotula of Salerno, a female medical scholar, whose writings, though later altered by men, provided practical and empathetic advice for treating women's health. She advocated for gentle treatments, hygiene, and consent. But over time her voice was buried beneath louder ones. Louder, crueler male voices. Because to control a woman's body was to control her fate, her role, her soul. And if surgery had become a tool of salvation for men, it had become a tool of silence for women. So, the next time we picture a medieval surgeon blade in hand, remember the patient beneath him was often female, and she wasn't just losing blood, she was losing autonomy. They wore long black robes, gloves of waxed leather, and beaked masks stuffed with herbs. To the terrified citizens of plague-ridden Europe, they looked like birds of ill omen. They were. The plague doctor has become a macabre icon, almost cartoonish in modern eyes. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, his presence was a death sentence. When the beaked silhouette appeared on your street, it meant someone inside your home was already dying or already dead. The bubonic plague didn't just change Europe, it shattered it. Entire villages were erased. Corpses lay unburied in the streets, bloated and black with rot. People dropped where they stood, blood streaming from their eyes and mouths. There were no real doctors, at least not ones brave or foolish enough to enter the homes of the infected. So they sent in the plague doctors, men who were part physician, part bureaucrat, part undertaker, and often completely untrained. Their beaked masks weren't just for spectacle. Inside, the doctor stuffed lavender, mint, and cloves, believing these sweet smells would purify the miasma the poisoned air thought to cause disease. The mask's glass lenses protected the eyes, while the long robe, often coated in wax or grease, was meant to prevent the foul humors from clinging to the skin. It didn't work, but it looked impressive, and that was often the point, because by the time the plague doctor arrived, healing was no longer expected. They didn't come to cure, they came to record. Their first task, document the number of infected in a household. Next, identify those who were too far gone. If possible, lance the buboes those grotesque swellings that appeared in the groin armpits and neck oozing pus and blackened blood. The idea was to let the poison out, but in practice it often spread the infection even faster. The knives weren't sterilized, the bandages were reused, and the patients already drowning in fever, vomiting, and internal bleeding. If the plague hadn't killed them yet, the treatment might. Some plague doctors carried a staff not just to poke at patients from a distance, but to beat them if they resisted. Yes, beat. In some regions, the infected were forcibly confined, chained to beds, their cries echoing through boarded-up houses. Parents watched their children rot alive. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky lingered for weeks, blind, delusional, oozing from every orifice. Autopsies were rare but increasingly demanded. Desperation forced experimentation. Some plague doctors dissected corpses in secret, hoping to find the nest of the disease. They opened bloated stomachs, pulled apart lungs like wet parchment, stared into blackened hearts. What they found was horror. What they understood? Nothing. The theories ranged from the ridiculous to the sadistic. Some believed the plague was divine punishment for sin and performed surgeries to let the sin out. Others thought the disease was spread by bad thoughts or by simply looking at someone who was infected. Whole families were walled inside their homes, sometimes burned alive, all under the supervision of men in masks. And yet, in this chaos, something began to shift. As the bodies piled up, people stopped listening to priests and started listening to surgeons. It didn't matter if their tools were crude. They were doing something. Lancing buboes, draining fluids, attempting amputations. They took risks, and in the rare cases when a patient lived, the surgeon became a savior. This gruesome desperation gave rise to some of the first plague hospitals' grim halls, filled with straw mattresses, wailing patients, and the stench of decay. Surgeons here worked day and night, slicing open lesions, cauterizing wounds, wrapping blackened limbs in wine-soaked cloths. Their hands were permanently stained red, their minds frayed by sleep deprivation and trauma. And the mask. That mask became more than protection. It became armor, a way to hide the human behind the horror. Because under the beak was often a man on the brink, terrified, hollow-eyed, haunted by the faces of children he couldn't save. Still, the treatments grew more desperate. Bloodletting increased. Patients were shaved head to toe and covered in mercury paste, then sealed in ovens, literally baked in an attempt to kill the infection. The mercury poisoned them. The heat scalded their flesh. Most died, but the few who survived became legends. In one account from Venice, a young girl was subjected to multiple rounds of bloodletting and mercury fumigation, her body left blistered and scarred. She lived, not because of the treatment, but in spite of it. Yet her recovery was heralded as proof the system worked. The